Hello.
Hello.
That's right. It is YouTube time this time, all the time.
If you like poetry, if you like literature, if you like cultural history, then you've come to the right place. We make podcasts about all of those things. So be sure to like and share this video. And of course, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload.
Since we mostly make podcasts, you can also find our shows on all the major podcast platforms. So if you found this video, but YouTube isn't your speed for regular podcast listening, head over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe there.
All right. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking. I am one of your co-hosts, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And I am your other co host, Jack Rossiter Mumley.
And we are back with a fresh new episode with a wonderful poem by the late, great Toni Morrison. It's one of the saddest ones of, I think, of my life, learning of her passing. And I actually didn't know she had published 5 poems in her life. She's mostly known as a novelist, as I'm sure you know. She's a Nobel laureate, Beloved, The Bluest Eye, Sula, Song of Solomon. She has famously said she detested being called a poetic writer.
She did indeed.
And so I thought, all right, it'd be a little not okay to bust out a passage from Beloved and talk about its lyrical qualities, of which there are many.
Undeniably.
Undeniably. But then I found that, in fact, she published 5 poems in 2002 in a kind of limited edition letterpress book that also were illustrated by Kara Walker, who received the poems and then sort of made silhouettes in response, and they're really beautiful. And so we picked one of those, the first line of which is "Someone leans near." And before we get going, as always, we are so appreciative of everyone who has rated us and reviewed us. It's helped so much get us new listeners. These past few months have been some of our biggest months in terms of listens and downloads and all that statistical stuff. And if you haven't, you can take a second, give us a little 5 stars, write us a little review. It would mean a lot.
It does mean a lot. It's really nice.
That's really nice. Yeah, so I mean, there's so much more to say about Toni Morrison and this poem, but why don't we just read it, and then we can get into all that.
Sounds good.
It's called "Someone Leans Near" by Toni Morrison. Someone leans near and sees the salt your eyes have shed. You wait, longing to hear words of reason, love or play to lash or lull you toward the hollow day. Silence kneads your fear of crumbled star ash sifting down, clouding the rooms here. You shore up your heart to run, to stay, but no sign or design marks the narrow way. Then on your skin a breath caresses the salt your eyes have shed. And you remember a call clear, so clear, you will never die again. Once more you know, you will never die again. Whew.
And we should note, in the line that says silence needs your fear, that's need like bread, not need like I need this to happen now. But I'm sure that the sonic doubleness there is intentional. To be that good at poetry is like not surprising when she's so incredibly good at novels and criticism and essays, and like every speech she ever gave was amazingly written too. Like, it's not really surprising that she'd be great at poetry too, but to just rock up and be that good at a type of writing that you don't really do, and to be good sort of within that on its own, like, the ways that this poem is good are like poetry good. It's not just, like,
Yeah.
I feel like it's not just a good poem, it's also good at poetry
Yeah.
in a way that is just shocking. And
Yeah.
like not shocking at the same time because she's just so good, but like I can't words around it well because it's so good.
No, I mean, you're totally right. And to be clear, I mean, many people have said this, and I agree. I feel like she's the best writer that I've ever read, and maybe it's one of the best writers ever. Period.
Absolutely. The way that
but
she just crafts language is astounding in like everything. I read her Nobel laureate speech again shortly after her passing, and it is so good. And it's like speech good. It does the thing that good speeches do, but it does it better than most speeches because she wrote it. So of course it was better. Like, it's just incredible. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Probably the best writer and language sculptor I have encountered.
Yeah. But I know what you mean. Like, oftentimes, like, it's rare to see poetry by someone who's mostly known for fiction, but there are probably more examples of poets who have written fiction or novels or something. And many of them are very good. And many of them are good in terms of a novel. But a lot of them are sometimes it's like clearly this is a poet writing a novel. And like, the certain, like sometimes I read those novels and I'm like, this is basically a 300-page poem and like a 300-page prose poem. And it's great, but it's like, in terms of the genre conventions, it's not even like knowing the rules to break them. It's just kind of like doing something.
Mm-hmm.
But as you were saying, like here, like this is a poem that knows it's a poem, that respects the form that it's in, and and it's really great. Before we get too deep into it, we often do play by play, just to get ourselves grounded in the work. And for this one, basically we have this second person who is kind of like the subject of the poem. It feels like one of those things where the you is actually the I in a way, or the speaker. And it begins with someone nearby noticing that the you has been crying. And as the next couple stanzas progress, we learn that the you is sort of waiting for some kind of solace, longing to hear words of reason, love, or play to lash or lull you toward the hollow day, and is feeling fear, about something we don't quite know what yet, perhaps, is trying to gather strength. You shore up your heart to run, but is kind of at a loss. No sign or design marks the narrow way. And then there's kind of the turn in the poem. Then on your skin a breath caresses the salt your eyes have shed. And the speaker, or the you, remembers someone saying, or some phrase, "You will never die again." And then the speaker kind of internalizes that by the end, and it's like, once more, you will never die again. And so by the end, I sort of feel like, and again, this is perhaps, it's on the nose, given the moment, and in a similar way to the episode we did on W.S. Merwin, his poem, and on the anniversary of my death. But we sort of get the sense by the end that perhaps this is a you who's facing death, or is, approaching old age and thinking about mortality, and is kind of like, afraid and unsure what to do about that.
I concur, and I have a question for you in the interest of further grounding. Do you know where this poem comes from?
Depending on what you're asking, I have one answer, which may not be what you were asking. But I was doing some reading about it. The quote at the end, "You will never die again," appears to be a reference to, and there's a great scholarly article about the 5 poems that Toni Morrison published, and the last line echoes the I think it's Gnostic scripture, thunder perfect mind, which was like some kind of long religious poem written like before 350 CE or something like that. But the end of the poem goes, "And they will find me there, and they will live, and they will not die again." And this is kind of like, or the crude reading of that poem is like finding sort of eternal life in, either in the afterlife or like in the mind or something like, or the spirit or something like that.
No, that was related to my question.
Okay.
And that is very interesting. But where this poem was used by Toni Morrison, and what I believe the poem is responding to, she put it in it usually gets categorized as a play, but it's kind of more than that, because there's also this woman who's a singer-songwriter who is involved. It's in Desdemona, which is this work that she did that is basically about the 4th act of Othello, where Desdemona is essentially waiting to get killed by Othello. She doesn't necessarily know that, but it's like this very dread-filled part of the play where anyone who's familiar with the text knows that's what's coming. Anyone who's not familiar still probably gets a strong sense of foreboding. And in that, Desdemona references and then sings parts of this song that comes up a couple times called the Willow Song. It's a sad old song. There's records of it kind of outside the play, and like essentially the content of the song is about like people in love, and maybe they're cheating on each other, and like it's kind of giving the audience the sense that the jealousy that's been going on is going to have a deadly end for Desdemona who's singing it. And this work is sort of written as a response to that in some ways, is what I have read. And in fact, in the Willow Song, there is a piece of it that says, "The fresh streams ran by her and murmured her moans, sing willow, willow, willow. Her salt tears fell from her and softened the stones. The main difference between the poem as it appears in Desdemona and as it appears where it was published is that all of the yous are I's and me's in Desdemona. But that is the other thing that this poem, I think, is sort of contextualized by, is its relationship to the character of Desdemona and the existence of the Willow song in Act 4, Scene 3 of Othello.
Interesting. Okay, so, wow, that is fascinating. So the play, just looking at it, was first produced in 2011.
Yeah, it postdates the original publication of the poem.
Yeah. So I guess it's either she'd been working on the play for a long time, or she had written the poem and then incorporated it into the play.
I would guess that she'd at the very least been probably thinking about Othello and particularly Desdemona for a long time. She'd been working on this project, a research project, and she read about a slave who had killed her child so that it wouldn't grow up enslaved, and that in many ways sort of began, percolating, I guess, as working towards what eventually became Beloved. So
wow. Well, that would give it a very different lilt. Seen in the context of like reading it autobiographically, if 2002, she must have been 70-ish,
yeah.
I think.
Yep.
We could think of it as someone facing death as like old age, mortality, but seen in the perspective of Desdemona, then we see it as like, I know bad things are coming for me in a certain kind of way, and I'm fearing for my life.
And Desdemona is like a teenager in the play. She's very young.
Oh man, that is such a great play, and that is very disturbing. But yeah. Anyway, interesting. Well, okay.
For me at least, it didn't change my experience of reading the poem all that much, because I felt like the feelings when I read through it, it's just a sense of like the foreboding that accompanies any serious contemplation of death, that I feel like the texture can change with age, but the actual sort of experience, the fundamental part of it, is very similar.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right.
And the kind of intimacy that it starts off with is, again, just kind of a similar human thing, and the texture of it can change a little bit depending on who you think is saying it. But, an opening line like, someone leans near and sees the salt your eyes have shed, essentially someone's close to your face and can see that you've been crying. And that, even independent of age, is such a strong experience to relate, and the way that the language shows it to you is so forceful that I find my experience of it being pretty similar, even independent of those different sort of contextual pieces.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and it's interesting how, and this is drawing a little bit from the article I read, but the kind of speaker is hoping for comfort or some kind of understanding, and it's like through this other person who's like characterized very vaguely and kind of weirdly. It's a someone. It's not maybe a total stranger. Is leaning near and sees that you've been crying, and then the only other, like, when And then there's the moment like when the turn happens, then on your skin a breath caresses the salt the salt your eyes have shed. A breath, which is like about as like faint a human connection can be in some ways. And then finally, the speaker remembers a call, which is you will never die again. So there's a memory of someone else saying this, or potentially if they're actually remembering the Gnostic verse or whatever, which I'm not sure it's that direct a reference, but it could just be some other encounter with language. But I was curious, like what, I don't know, what so I feel like it's clear that the speaker, like comes to some kind of comfort or understanding by the end of the poem through this understanding that, once more you will never die again. And I guess the two things that I was wondering about is like, what does you will never die again mean, I guess? And then the other is like, what does the other or the presence of another or another's voice, like, why does that sort of lead to such an understanding or something like that? I don't know if that's a well formulated question, but
Yeah, it is interesting because there is this sense of, I guess, acceptance at the end that partially comes through that feeling of the repetition of you will never die again, because that's still essentially saying you're going to die, which is terrifying. And the whole poem is infused with this like fear and tension, because the someone, as you were saying, like unnamed, sort of an unknown quantity, because the you is waiting to hear what they do, and it's literally tension. You shore up your heart to run, to stay. That's fight or flight reflex. And to have that ending give you the repeated you will never die again, is that like resignation? Is that I wasn't quite sure, because it didn't feel like it fully diffused the tension that had been built up to that point. It felt like that tension remained, because you also, like, you remember a call clear, so clear, and then in quotations it says you will never die again. And I know those quotations are referencing the remembered call, but my immediate image that I created is of this someone leaning over the speaker saying to them, you will never die again, which in that context feels like a threat. And it's almost in those next lines that threat is transformed by being repeated. Even though I know it's not actually a threat, it's a remembered call, but in some ways, I think what I was seeing is the speaker putting those words into the mouth of the someone who is near. But I was a little puzzled about where exactly to go, because my immediate feeling, I don't know. I mean, maybe you're supposed to be left with that tension because there is no resolution to a real contemplation of death or its potential proximity, because the someone leaning near doesn't have to be a literal someone. It can be just the presence of death or the unknown or dying or illness in a sort of cliched reading. It could be a Grim Reaper type figure. Someone is close to you while you're in this distress. But I don't know. It definitely leaves a note of like partial but not complete resolution that I found. It felt like it fit really well with the poem, but it does retain that unsettling quality, which leaves it a little bit like, I want a nice clean way to end this. I want a story to tell myself that makes this less tense, but that would also be less true, so maybe not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You gave me a thought that I have to postpone until my other thought, because that one has to come first. Here's the thing. So, well, there were two in this article, and I'm not doing the thing where I have an answer and I'm not telling you it, because
I already did that this episode. So you can't do it too.
That's true. You did. But
I
you
did
did
do
that
that.
in a very leading way. It was clear that you knew you had an answer. But I didn't bring it up because I'm not sure that I agree with these responses, and so I wanted to hear what you were saying. But like the Lee, who wrote this scholarly article about the poems, is talking about this. Someone leans near. So like they're talking about how the line "you will never die again" moves from being in quotes to not being in quotes, and how sort of the "you" has internalized its meaning. But then the ultimate message of, and they are comparing it to the Thunder Perfect Mind, that Gnostic text. The ultimate message of that text and the someone of the poem is the same. Quote, "Death is an illusion." And then later says that the subject of the poem in this poem understands her immortality through the caring presence of another. Although this you is physically alone, she derives comfort and courage from the memory of another. Death presents no obstacle to the vibrancy of the living. And then I encountered these 5 poems on the Believer, which is a great online site and journal, and they had posted these poems and had written some notes about them. And Jericho Brown, who's the poetry editor there, said this about all 5 poems. So not specifically this one, but it seemed to be definitely thinking about this poem. So Brown says, "Her work in verse seems over and again to show us a woman facing death, and facing it with all the life she can. It's as if she knows who she is, and that, in that knowing, her declarations here will live forever." So there's 2 kinds of sentiments of this like immortality kind of sense, which I can get from the meaning of "you will never die again," as in like, in a way you've already died or something. Maybe it's your physical death or whatever, and now you're immortal or something. And I can see a compelling way to read that in terms of, especially now considering Morrison's legacy and just like the enduring nature of her work, and how like there was this, it was the what scrolling through the Twitterverse, and there were many pretty poignant things about Morrison. And someone had retweeted the dictionary.com tweet, which was actually just so perfect. But the tweet was, "Beloved, noun, a person who is greatly loved." And I thought that was a very beautiful tribute.
That's wonderful.
But it made me think again of, rethinking of the word beloved, and the way that the person is defined in that context as they're being loved by another or many others, and this sense that the memory and the care of other people is what can make someone endure or live on in certain ways. And I think, you could argue is what makes a person live in when they're alive. Anyway, so like I guess I can see what Stephanie Lee, the scholar, is saying, the critic, and I can see what Jericho Brown is saying. But at the same time, as you were kind of pointing out, there's this unresolved tension, and there seems to be another way of reading it, of reading that last line, "You will never die again," which is like, once you die, that's it. Like, that's the last time you die, kind of thing. And that there's a finality to that, and a finality to death, which is sort of unlike, everything else in life. I think what was Morrison said, like, the meaning of life may be death.
We die, that may be the meaning of life, but we do language, that may be the measure of life. I think that's the quote.
Yeah.
Taken. The only reason I know that is because I reread her Nobel laureate speech, and it's from that speech.
Yeah, and so, okay, this finally brings me to my thought that I had to wait, which was, you were talking about wanting the satisfying kind of neat or conclusive ending and not having it. And it's so interesting because I was just thinking about the form of the poem, which there's a lot to talk about. But, sometimes we talk about like, I don't know if we've used these terms, but perfect and imperfect poems, or closed and open poems. And, there's an essay by Louise Glick who talks about that, and how she prefers the imperfect and the open poems. But if you think of like a traditional sonnet, that like has the rhyming couplet at the end, and there's the beginning, there's like an argument, and then, or like something, like in the one Shakespeare thing that I always quote, "That time of year thou mayst in me behold," which is like, I'm dying, and you know that I'm dying, and then at the end is like, you perceive that I'm dying, this thou perceivest, which makes thy love grow strong, to love that which must leave ere long, or something. And so the conclusion, which is like, you see that I'm dying and therefore you love me, has a conclusiveness to it, right? It closes off the problems that were raised in the beginning. And in that way, you can say that's a closed poem, or that's a perfect poem, kind of thing. And what's interesting about this poem is, like, it has so many hallmarks of what a perfect or a closed poem would be. It's not in a traditional like form like a sonnet, but the rhymes and the repetitions are very pronounced. You have like, there's a ear rhyme that happens throughout the poem. Someone leans near, you wait longing to hear, silence needs your fear. You remember, or clouding the rooms here, you remember a call clear, so clear. There's also like end rhymes that happen, like one after another, like a couplet. You wait longing to hear, and then words of reason, love or play, to lash or lull you toward the hollow day. You shore up your heart to run, to stay, but no sign or design marks the narrow way. So that play, day, stay, way. Then there's also, these two moments of like repeating a word, like in the same line. So clouding the rooms here, here, and you remember a call clear, so clear. And then finally, just to like list all the repetitions and the rhymes so you can, get a kind of sense of the texture, is there's two lines that repeat basically identically. So, and someone leans near and sees the salt your eyes have shed. And then on your skin a breath caresses. Then on your skin a breath caresses the salt your eyes have shed. So the salt your eyes have shed repeats, and notably that repeats for the turn. And then finally we have, and you remember a call clear, so clear, quote, you will never die again. Once more you know you will never die again. And especially ending with that exact repetition of a line, it sonically feels very closed. Like the rhymes are such a pleasing way to end it, and it feels like tight like a bow kind of thing. And so there's this, like, I feel like in the poem, part of you is like, we've got all this repetition, and it leads into this like sort of this line that repeats so close together. And so it feels like we're reaching some kind of final conclusion.
That's fantastic. And I like both your thoughts, because the first thought, which is such a much more generous and upbeat reading than the direction I instinctually went in, and that might say a lot more about me than the poem, because I also thought the Ted Kooser poem we talked about a little while ago, Abandoned Farmhouse, was very creepy, and we had a listener tell us they thought it was not creepy, so maybe this is a me thing. But I love the idea that you will never die again isn't like this is as bad as it gets, but this is just one thing that you do, and death is part of life, and like it's not going to happen again, but so what else do you expect? You're not going to get born again either. But I do really like that more generous sort of take on that ending, and I think I will adopt it myself, because I like to be positive, and I really do. I feel like that's more the direction the poem probably wants to go in terms of where it's moving. And I really like what you were discussing with the formal moves, because the sounds are so tight throughout the poem, because even the lines that don't have those end rhymes, like then on your skin a breath caresses, but those last lines are the ones where after that, and you remember a call clear, so clear, where that calls back to where the hears are repeated, and also the other ear with near, here, fear throughout the rest of the poem. After that, the repeated sounds from the rest of the poem are gone. And we've talked before, and in fact, I'm pretty sure there's a joke in the Othello scene that does this for emphasis, where there's a full rhyme at the end, like a regular couplet at the end of a poem that'll hit hard rhymes to give that exact feeling of, if not resolution, completion. I think when they're talking about infidelity as a joke to Desdemona, the woman she's talking to, they're talking about like, would you basically like cheat on your husband for the entire world? And she's like, ooh, so great a price for so small a vice. And Desdemona's like, nah, I wouldn't cheat on Othello. He's the best. Anyway, the fact that like sonic tightness starts to move away a little bit, even though the lines are repeated, so it's still very formally constrained in that way. The sort of really tight crafting of the sounds starts to expand a little bit and is lost, which I feel like contributes to that unresolved perfect versus imperfect poem, like more of that imperfect poem feel, which is kind of cool. I like it.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good point. I like that a lot. Yeah, and also just there's so many, this is just a separate, but like I love to lash or lull. you
Oh,
toward
yeah.
the hollow day is so good. Partly because I love thinking about like those are the two like desired outcomes of like how to get you through the day is like either to be like pacified by like to be lulled by words of reason or to be like lashed into get to get yourself going or whatever. There's a kind of like interesting violence there.
Mhm.
And it did make me think of like, I mean, this is probably too reading into autobiographical, but just a sense of, having, obviously I cannot speak as I am still a man of relative, though waning youth.
Oh dear.
That, in old age, it's more common to have a lot of time for the day to be full of time in a kind of way, like, and a question of how to fill it, and that's kind of what I was thinking about, like what the image that came to me when I read Hollow Day, like a kind of empty day, and needing something to like get you going or like stop you from thinking about it, to lull you or whatever. Should we read it again?
I think we should read it again.
Someone leans near and sees the salt your eyes have shed. You wait, longing to hear words of reason, love or play to lash or lull you toward the hollow day. Silence needs your fear of crumbled star ash sifting down, clouding the rooms here. You shore up your heart to run, to stay. But no sign or design marks the narrow way. Then on your skin a breath caresses the salt your eyes have shed. And you remember a call clear, so clear, you will never die again. Once more you know you will never die again.
Hey, thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Those reviews help us with the algorithm and are the best way for us to find new listeners.
Do you have thoughts about this poem? Or is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? We would love to hear from you, and there are tons of ways to get in touch.
Yes, you can send us an email to closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. I'm at Jack Rossiter Munn, Connor is at Connor M. Stratton, and the show is at Close Talking.
On Instagram, we are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/closetalking.
And speaking of all of those many and varied social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena.
Woo woo!
Woo.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Come back again.
Please come back just one more time.
Door's always open. Okay, bye.
See ya.